Well, thank you, Dr. Ollendick, for agreeing to participate in this new endeavor that we have, our scientific journey, where we are exploring the different paths that individuals take to reach their scientific goals, scientific careers. So we were wondering if you can start off with a little bit of background, telling us about yourself, about where you went to high school, where were you born, your undergrad, and where you are right now, because that's really important.
Yeah. Well, it all started a long time ago in a little town in Nebraska. I was born in Nebraska, in a little town called Tilden, Nebraska. And my father and mother had a family farm. So I was born there, and I was the fourth of 7 children.
Wow.
So I have 5 brothers, and me makes 6 boys and 1 sister. And the first 5 brothers were all pretty close in age. In fact, the brother who's older than I am, he and I overlap, being the same age, for about 3 weeks. And a younger brother and I are the same age at certain times. And his birthday and mine overlap by about 5 weeks, 5.5 weeks.
Wow.
So my mother was very busy.
I can imagine.
And she was a typical Midwestern mom, I suppose, at that time. But my father has a 3rd grade education, stopped schooling when he was a young boy because he was on the family farm and they needed farm help. My mother, on the other hand, has a high school degree. And I say that because back then, this is in the 40s, 1940s or so, back then you could teach in high school if you had a high school degree. And so my mother had a school lined up to teach in, but then got married and became pregnant straight away with my older brother, one of my older brothers, and then never got to teach. And so part of my values from both my mother and my father came from some of my mother's unfulfilled expectations that she wanted to teach at some point in time and wanted a career in education, but never had it because of her life circumstance at the time. So it really did start a long time ago. And went to this one-room schoolhouse, my first 3 grades of school. There were 13 students in this school, 13.
Wow.
Kindergarten through 8th grade. And I had a classmate. 2 of my brothers did not. And 5 of the 13 in that school were brothers.
Yours.
My brothers, yeah. So really, I come from very, very modest, humble beginnings. No indoor plumbing, no electricity until I was 8 or 9 years of age. I can remember twins, sibling twins, who were born about 7 years after I was born. And when they were about to be born, we had then moved from Nebraska to Iowa. But in that journey, my parents decided they needed to get indoor plumbing and electricity because they had these 2 new babies that were in the family. So we got indoor plumbing when I was 7, 8, 9 years of age. I'm blocking a little bit there, whether it was 7, 8, or 9. But it was after I was in this one-room schoolhouse for a couple of years. So it all had very modest beginnings. I went to high school in Iowa, and then went to a small college in Iowa called Loris College. It's an all-men's college, liberal arts college, which I just really loved. Very small, 1,400 students.
That is quite small.
Went through 5 majors before I decided on psychology.
What were they? Do you remember them?
Oh, I sure do. I started out in theology as a major, and then I went to philosophy and tried that for a while. That was my real love, was philosophy. Then tried math and found out that I wasn't quite as good at that as I wanted to be, so went into biology. And then psychology as a senior. I went into psychology as a major in college as a senior. So the pathway isn't very direct. It's very circuitous in terms of how I got to where I am. And then I married in 1967, right after graduating from college, and went to Purdue for my graduate training. And did my graduate training at both Purdue and Yale, because my my major professor at Purdue had done some work with a professor at Yale, Ed Ziegler, who's a fairly well-known person in child development and clinical child psychology. And I worked with him for part of that time. But my degree is from Purdue, and but I'm part of this is that my path was not very direct. It was very much a path of circumstance and sometimes happenstance. The things that happened along the way occasioned that to happen. While at Purdue, I was in clinical psychology, but I was seeing a child who was really extremely fearful and anxious. And I know, Dr. Diaz, that you do some work in this area.
Yes.
And but that struck me as to how panicky this young person was. And I did this very intensive case study on this child that got published in the leading journal of psychology at the time, Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. And I was intending to be a clinician and to work in seeing families and children, adolescents. But then I got this first publication. I thought, there's another life here. And I turned on to science probably about halfway through my doctoral degree, although I suppose I was always interested in science because of my various majors, whether they're in even philosophy. I was interested in the philosophy of science, and so I always had a scientific bent, but really got turned on to it when I was in graduate school and had this wonderful mentor who took me under wing and helped me publish. And when I graduated in 1971 with my PhD, I already had 2 publications, which these days isn't a lot, but then it was like very, very rare to have publications in leading journals at that time. So that's what got me going, was that pathway.
Well, that sounds very, very interesting, and every time I interview somebody, it's always very different. So, what do you think? What experiences in school influence you to pursue your career in science? Basically, was there certain teachers that influenced you? Was it a class that you took? Was it a mentor during your graduate school that was a key influence in that decision?
Yeah, all the above, and probably more. But truly, though, I don't mean to be facetious with this, but it really was just a lot of different things coming together. As I said initially, I did not intend to go into a scientific career. I intended to be a counselor, a therapist, a helper. But then when I saw, at graduate school in particular, that science was there and could start to study the things that I wanted to look at in a very scientific way. So my major professor was very keen on us doing really evidence-based work back then, which is now the buzzword, but then it was really not very common. And so we were doing these things. We would do these case studies, and we'd publish them. We also did these. I was on a grant that my major professor had from the National Institute of Health. Worked with him on that for, like, say, I think it must have been like 3 years in graduate school probably. That was extremely instrumental. My major professor himself, Dr. Jerry Gruen, who's a developmental psychologist. So even though I was in clinical, I had interest in development and biology at that time, and deliberately sought out a non-clinical advisor for my major professor. And Jerry was a University of Illinois graduate, but also had worked with this Ed Ziegler at Yale, whom I mentioned before, and was very, very much interested in facilitating a research-type career in his students. And so as actually part of that, Jerry arranged for me to go to Yale to work with this Ed Ziegler, whom I mentioned. And so I did that for a couple of summers during my graduate training, and just got terribly excited about all that work and went in that direction. And that first publication, as you well know, you get that first one.
It's an amazing feeling.
It's an amazing feeling
Yeah.
to see that I did it, and I was the lead author on both of them, so it was just fantastic. And I showed them to my parents, and they, of course, were very excited. This is their boy, right? Their son who did this, and a lot of things just started to reverberate then, and I enjoyed that kind of work. Seeing stuff published and seeing stuff looked at in a very scientific, critical way my philosophy of science helped a lot too, because I always had interest in how we study things, and what's the philosophy behind that. It's very important to me.
Oh, I can definitely understand your love for research, because there's something about you collecting the data. Well, first of all, formulating, a hypothesis, collecting the data, and then looking at the results to see whether your theory, your train of thought was correct. So there's definitely a great sense of accomplishment there, and then to put it on paper.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Precisely.
Were you encouraged to pursue a graduate career from your family, friends?
Well, I certainly, with a major in psychology as an undergraduate, at that time, and even to this day, most people who get a undergraduate degree in psychology go on to graduate school. It's just almost necessary to do. And even then, this is like 40 years ago that we're talking about, but even then it was clear that one would go on to graduate school to further one's education, whether it be to go in the clinical route, to be like a doctor and see patients, or to go into academia and become a professor, or to go into a research institute or a state agency. Almost all those you had to have a graduate education for. Certainly, I was encouraged to do that by my parents, my siblings, my wife at that time after college, to pursue it. So a lot of support was there to do that.
That's great. And definitely always helps to have that supportive background. You mentioned that you had two very influential advisors, one in Purdue and one in Yale. Would you consider them your mentors?
Oh, by all means, yes. In fact, my first book was dedicated to both of them. Yes, without them, clearly it would not have gotten to where it has gotten to. And I actually value them very highly and like to envision that I'm the kind of mentor that they were for me by being available to my students.
That was my next question. What do you think makes a good mentor?
Oh, goodness. A lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of commitment, a lot of enthusiasm for working with people and developing them. So when I went away from kind of seeing patients and helping them, I still had this urge to help people. And so for me, a big part of it was to help beginning graduate students and to get them under wing. I also do independent studies with undergraduates. I do a lot of one-on-one kind of mentoring with students. Still maintain very good relationships with almost all of my former doctoral students, 41 of whom now are out there in the world. So 41 PhDs under my tutelage, if you will. And I still am in contact with even my first one. One of my first doctoral students is a professor at Louisiana State University. And Tom Davis, a graduate of this program, one of my students, is now there working with Johnny Matson is his name. And so my first student now is the chair of one of my students since being here. And so it's like where there's generations now of graduate students that have gone on to do well and to be in various places. But yes, both of them were really good mentors. They were organized, they were funded, which helped a lot. They had creative ideas, they were very involved. They always had time to work with me, and I now try to, at least in turn with my own students, to find that time to be available to them. So it's a life fulfillment for me to be in this position. I couldn't think of a better job than what I have currently.
From doing this, I see a little theme when it comes to what makes a good mentor, and that seems that an individual is a good mentor if they're very student-focused, if their focus is on the student and really promoting their development and promoting their careers.
I think one of the critical things for me has always been to, no matter, and you're a former student so you know this, but no matter what form something comes in, there's always something good about it, and finding the good in what's there. And then indicating to the student that, hey, this is really great, we can work with this. It may take us 4 or 5 revisions, as it oftentimes does, but we can work with it. And it's finding the positive in what people are doing that I think is extremely important there, and the nurturing of that relationship. So it's never that this is a bunch of trash. I remember, frankly, one of my professors at Purdue, I'm not sure I should put this on camera, but I turned in my master's thesis. And he said, and this is a literal thing, so please don't be offended by this, but it was, this is the biggest piece of shit I've ever seen.
Wow.
I mean, this was one of my committee members. And I said to my major professor, who was very nurturing and very much the opposite, I said, I went to him crying as a master level graduate student. Saying, I didn't do it that badly. And I was really upset, with that, of course. But that was a totally wrong thing to say to a student,
Mm-hmm.
to think of how you foster a career, and you can facilitate without being destructively critical. You can be very constructive in your approach. I think that's a very important thing for professors to do, and to be a good mentor. Find out what the student has that can really be worked with, and then to hone in on that, and then try to help them excel at that.
Given that experience that you went through.
Traumatic.
Yes.
Traumatic.
Very traumatic. It's not unusual that the first go-round might not be that person's best, or that it still needs some work. How did you cope in that situation?
Well, I almost dropped out of graduate school, that would not be healthy coping. B, I talked to my major professor. I introspected in myself. I talked to my wife. I called other people I knew, like other students and other faculty members, and tried to talk with them. And they said, oh, that's just the way X is. That's the way, it was a he, that's the way he is. People just learn to put up with him. And I thought, no, that's not right. You shouldn't have to put up with that. And I hope if I become a professor, I'm never going to do that. And I can bet your bottom dollar I've never done that to a student or anything like that. So I coped initially emotionally. There's what's called emotion-focused coping and active-focused coping. And emotionally was where I had to be at that time. I was very upset. That's what I had to do with my emotions. But then after the day, I had to then think of constructive ways of doing it. And my goal at that time, and this may have been very instrumental in my career, was like, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do it well. So this guy can't say that again about my work, at least. And he never did again. Now maybe he got feedback from other people, but he never said that again to me. But something I had done. So it was difficult, certainly, and it was a learning experience. But I think one that probably has made me the better person as a result. I didn't think that at the time, I can assure you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that personal experience, because as a past graduate student, and knowing graduate students, I know that obstacles come in the way. And it's always good to know that even someone so successful as yourself had obstacles in their way. So would you talk about other challenges that you face in graduate school and through your pursuit?
Oh goodness, there are just so many of them. In graduate school, they're the typical ones that most graduate students encounter. It's like, how do you find the right advisor? I had a different advisor before the one I settled on, and that first advisor and I just didn't click. And it's oftentimes hard to change advisors in graduate school, but it's acceptable, and I think one just has to do it if it becomes necessary. And I did that. This experience that I mentioned to you about. Coursework. I actually was very fortunate because I completed all of my graduate degree in 4 years, including my internship. So I was 3 years in my PhD.
Wow, that's...
And then a year of internship.
Not usual anymore.
And I was able to do that because I had, again, a support group, my wife, and at that time I had a young daughter also, by the way. As a fourth year, my last year of graduate school, our older daughter now was born. So I knew I had these family commitments as well as other obligations. And I set the sail, and I'm a pretty achievement-oriented person, and determined that I could do this, and I was going to overcome whatever I had to overcome to be able to do that. So yeah, there were obstacles in the way, and all along, just different things in terms of, I still get manuscripts rejected. I got my degree in 1971. But literally, 41 years later now, last month, well, let's see, in June, so maybe 2 months ago now, I got a manuscript rejected from a very good journal. And I'm saying to myself, when am I going to learn how to do this right? What do I need to do different? And just things like that you continue to get. I got 2 grants turned down last year. Again, I should know how to play the academic game, right? And I should know how to do these things. And I do, but sometimes it's just not in your hands. And so what I think I have learned is that these challenges really strengthen me. And they are challenges. I view them that way, in fact, is that whenever I fail at something, my dissertation, as I said, was called The Success of Failure, the Failure of Success. It was deliberately done that way because what I wanted to indicate is that failure sometimes can lead to very successful outcomes. And too much success can lead to failure because you get too accustomed to doing everything and getting everything, that you're not developing resilience and issues like that. And so I did my dissertation on exactly part of what made sense to me and what I was dealing with at the time. And Ed Ziegler at Yale helped me design these. In fact, we did some of the work up in New Haven, Connecticut for my dissertation. Part of it in Indiana at Purdue. But in any event, it's like how you deal with these obstacles and the kind of attitude you have about them, I think, is extremely important to have.
So here you are. You defended your dissertation. You graduated. What was your next step? Where did you go? Thinking about like what you would, what most people would think about the usual PhD path, undergrad, graduate school, maybe postdoc, academia, industry. What was your next step?
Well, I did do a postdoc, 1-year postdoc in Philadelphia at the Devereaux Center, which was an institute for clinical research. And so I wanted to develop my research even more. And since I was able to get through graduate school in those 4 years, I then could take what I had anticipated to be a 5-year journey and do a postdoc there. And then after that, which is extremely useful for me and very important to do, I then had 3 job offers in 1972 at Yale, Michigan, and a small school in Indiana called Indiana State University. And Yale offered me a salary of $9,500 for an academic year. Michigan was $10,500, and Indiana State was $13,500. I went to Indiana State for a variety of reasons. I had a family then, as I mentioned. Our daughter was born in 1970, so she would have been 2 at the time. And my wife was at home at that time with our daughter, and so I was the sole breadwinner at that stage, although both of us had worked before that, of course, for several years, and then after that. But at that time, it was an issue of finances. I had to make a decision that, frankly, my major professor and others thought was the wrong decision to make. I should have gone to Yale. I should have gone to Michigan. But I went to Indiana State, and I, in all humility, I became probably a big fish in a little pond, and did very well there. So it turned out to be a very good move for me, very supportive environment. I then, over the years, have done 4 kind of like postdocs in a sense, but they're called sabbaticals at that stage. I did one in London with Michael Rudder and Bill Ewell, who you know some of these names I know. And then I did another one in Australia with a psychiatrist and another psychologist I work with extensively. One in Sweden, and one at Western Psychiatric Institute in Pittsburgh at the medical school. So I have these 4 different sabbaticals sprinkled in throughout. Moved here to Virginia Tech in 1980, so 32 years ago now. It seems impossible, 32 years ago. But I taught at Indiana State from 1972 to 1979. Then moved here in the fall of '79. That's right. Yes. And came here, and then I've been here since. And one of the sabbaticals I had while at Indiana State, the one in Pittsburgh, but the 3 international ones have all been since I've been here at Virginia Tech, all of which have been extremely important in my life trajectory. In terms of making connections, we do a lot of international work. And being in Australia and Sweden and England certainly turned corners for me in terms of meeting people and making connections that were just extremely important. So it's been I got this University Distinguished Professorship in 1999 here at Virginia Tech.
Congratulations.
So that's now, 13 years ago, and that was in recognition of my work. And it's a fantastic arrangement. I am able to do pretty much what I wish to do in terms of teaching and service and research. I have my own center here. Life is good. Life is very good.
Sounds very, very good. Would you mind commenting on some of the research that you've done?
Mm-hmm. Yes, surely. Well, our most of our work is in the area of anxiety and fear in children and adolescents, and looking at that with families. I developed a schedule for children called the Fear Survey Schedule for Children back in 1973. No, 1983, excuse me, yeah. 73, it was 73, that's right. So it's been around a long time. So I've been translated into 30-some languages, and that has generated lots of research activity. Initially, we started out more on the psychopathology, trying to understand the various disorders of childhood and adolescence. And so my main interest was anxiety and fear, and then trying to really grapple what it means to have that. How does it occur? What are the causes of these disorders? And I know some of the things that, of course, that you have looked at as well, like temperament, extremely important, behavioral inhibition being a key one, the initial fear response in infants and how that gets maintained over time. But we started to work on that, and then over time we moved our work more toward interventions, so now how to help people who have these problems. So more recently, we've had a fourth NIMH grant that we currently have on looking at fear and anxiety in children and trying to treat that. And our most recent grant looks at how anxiety gets transmitted from parent to child, and whether or not we can design a intervention that will help moms. In this case, dads would be appropriate too, but frankly, moms are more accessible to us, and of the families we work with, up to about a fourth to maybe a third are in single-parent families, and most ordinarily with the mother, a few cases with the father, but usually with the mom. And so we're looking at how we're identifying mothers who have an anxiety disorder, and then we're looking at how they talk with their child and what they do with their child to transmit that anxiety from parent to child. And we see some very interesting patterns. And we see it in dads too, but we're studying it in moms at the moment. And that is that moms are overprotective. They'll say a lot of things to their children that will occasion anxiety and will maintain it over time. So in one of our tests that we do here at the center called a behavioral approach test, that's just one example, we might have, say, a child who's extremely fearful of dogs or of costume characters or anything else like that. And we'll have the mother and child go into the room where at the other end of the room is a dog, let us say. And the mother will say things to the child, will say to the parents that in a few minutes I want you to go into the room with your son or your daughter. And at the other end of the room is a dog, and one of my helpers is there with the dog. And I want Tommy to go up and pet the dog for about 10 seconds on the head. Ready? And he can do as much as he wants, and we'll give them some other instructions like that. Some of these moms are anxious themselves, will say things like, well, remember, Tommy, he said, you don't really have to do it if you don't want to. Or they might say something like, well, what if it's a big dog? Or what if it's the kind of dog that chased you last month? So they will say things to the child. They'll transmit, in other words, anxiety. Not only, if you will, constitution, because a lot of these kids are behaviorally inhibited, and so they will have some of that process. Oftentimes the parents themselves have had anxiety, and then they say and do things that transmit anxiety to the child. So what we've also done now, and I don't want to blame parents here, because what we've done is actually taken some anxious children and put them with moms who are not anxious, and we've taken some non-anxious kids and put them with moms who are anxious.
Yeah.
So we've done what's called cross-fostering in terms of how to look at this issue. And what we find is that the moms who were not anxious themselves, if given an anxious child to work with, you start to do the same things those parents did within about an hour. So you start to be overly protective, you start to nurture, to protect them, etc., even though you yourself didn't have any of those properties before. And moreover, what's equally important, I think, is that when you take these mothers who do this with their anxious child and give them a non-anxious child, they're perfectly normal with that child. So it's really showing, to a large degree, what many people in our fields have shown, that it's that transaction between the child and the parent that's really the action, what the action is.
Oh, that sounds like some pretty amazing research and very interesting.
Extremely interesting, yes, yeah, and very fascinating because we're finding things out that people didn't think we would be able to show. We also do work with autism spectrum disorder kids, and we do work with aggressive kids, and I have always tried to be kind of Renaissance is much too lofty, but a person who looks at different disorders in different areas so that we can look at commonalities across problems and see similarities and dissimilarities. And so I've always been interested in how the interface of different kinds of parenting and different kinds of kids, different kinds of problems, different kinds of social contexts that might be present.
Excellent. Well, do you have any idea of what makes a successful graduate student? So if you were, talking to an incoming graduate student or someone who's thinking about graduate students, what qualities are necessary in that individual?
Well, that's really a good question. I have to pause for a moment. I've only had 41 PhDs, but I can actually go back and I mean, obviously, they've all been, in my opinion, very, very good students. But some have been better than others. Quite clearly, you couldn't have 41 of them all being the very, very best. But I think the primary features are, first of all, an inquisitive mind. I think it's just extremely important. Someone who wants to understand and has a real thirst for knowledge. They have something they want to pursue, and they want to explore, and they're excited about it. So that energy level, that excitement is just really, really critical, I think. Then you superimpose that on a bright person who has some basic capabilities of doing things, and a person who's persistent. So I would say energetic, bright, and persistent are the three main features that I would look at and have looked at in graduate students. So they have to be hungry, they want to explore something and do it. They have to have the mind or the ability to do it, and then they have to have the tolerance or the stick-to-itiveness to follow through on things. There are a lot of awfully bright, creative, and capable people out there. And of course in graduate school we get a number of those. I last year had 50-some applicants who wanted to come and work with me here at Virginia Tech, and took one student. But they all met the criteria in terms of being bright, in terms of being good grades. Those are they're out there. But what you need is this fire in the belly sort of student. And I'd probably add a fourth feature, actually, and that would be that a student who's I'm not sure quite how to say this, but a student who has her head in the right place, or his head in the right place. And by that I mean some balance to their life, that they are desirous of doing these things, but they also can have fun. They're fun to be around. They're invigorating. I've said to many, many people over the years that without my graduate students, I'd be nobody. And that's really true. It really is true. They keep me going. And that's the key, I think, is finding people and surrounding yourself with exciting students. I think that's really the key, certainly for me. And I've been very, very fortunate to get some outstanding students. And as I say, I continue to collaborate with them. Just this year alone, I published 4 books this year, and 2 of them were with 4 students, former students. One is a professor at LSU and one a professor at Houston. But both of them, just very, very great students. And Amy Grills-Taquachel, who graduated 12 years ago, her first book, after being out in academics, and Tom Davis, the person I mentioned maybe earlier, at LSU, Tom and I just did a book together, and he's been out about 6 years or 7 years. So I mean, just the point is that you surround yourself with these energetic people who invigorate life, and life is good. They pull the best from the professors too, by the way. I would say is that it's really that transaction. If you have a student who's not very invested and involved, it's easy for the professor to become de-invested. You can only do so much, right?
Yeah.
And it works both ways, obviously. But when you have that chemistry going there, then it's a nice combination.
So definitely a good fit between you and the mentor.
Jerome Kagan a long time ago talked about goodness of fit, didn't he?
Yes.
And that's exactly what it is in graduate school too. It's a goodness of fit. It's how well. And there's some students whom I really like very much and relate extremely well to that some other professors probably would not. And it might be because they're either too hungry or they're too wanting to interact more. And I don't mean that as anything negative about professors, but just that some people get off on, get reinforced by, as I do, those kinds of individuals. And so for me, they're very much alive and well.
Well, you mentioned that out of college you got married, and during your graduate school you had your first child. So how did you manage your personal life and your work life, your professional life?
Difficultly, and with an awful lot of just energy and support. I'm fortunate to have a very wonderful partner who's very much academically inclined herself and who was very supportive of me at that time. And my colleagues, my professors, my fellow students, some of the other ones were married too, so we had colleagues who were in this boat together. But it was a balance act by all means. I mean, our young daughter was a very active child. In fact, would be, in terms of temperament, not at all behaviorally inhibited. We're on the other end of the dimension, kind of very action-oriented little child. And so she didn't require a lot of sleep. And so that was also, I didn't get much sleep. So, but we worked it out with different systems and balancing time. I'm fortunate to be a person who requires about 6 hours of sleep a night. So I'm fortunate because even then I could typically get about that many hours of sleep a night. Much to my wife's chagrin now, she only needs about 6 hours a night, and she says, sleep. I'm like, I am. But it's time to get up, so I just don't require a lot of sleep. So that helped a lot. But again, it really wasn't that so much as, it wasn't me, it was more the environment that I had around me. If I call my wife part of my environment, or my colleagues part of my environment, the support that was there. It was difficult, sort of, and then all the way through, our daughters now are married and have children, we have grandchildren, 5 grandchildren. And so even all along those, they went through grade school and high school and college, and now their children are in school. And so we find time now to go visit. It's hard, so I don't mean to paint just a rosy picture here, because it's not really that rosy, I suppose. But it's what you make out of it, that makes it work. And so we take time to go visit our grandchildren and daughters and their families, and they come to visit us. And so we try to just work that into part of our lifestyle. That's part of what I meant before by a graduate student who can have his or her head in the right place. And I think professors too can have their heads in the wrong place. And the right place for me is a nice balance between family and profession. If you look at my website, it says right at the beginning that family is a very important part of who I am and where I have been and where I'm going. So it's that balance. And my motto is work hard and play hard. And I sincerely mean that if you work hard, then you create time to play hard.
So make the time.
Yeah, make the time, exactly. Yeah, precisely.
Well, if we can leave with one final question. If you had any advice, or if you wish someone had told you a tip or something before you had gone into graduate school, do you have any advice or something you wish someone would have told you beforehand that would have made your life a little bit easier?
Yeah, it certainly would have made it more easier or understandable at the time. And part of that is academic life is extremely good, but it's extremely time-consuming also. My typical work week, as most professors, will be around 60 hours a week. And if I had known back then that I might have been orienting myself that way, I think I still would have done it, by all means. But I think I would have had a slightly different take on it initially, because I think initially I was put off by some of that, but yet I had to do it to excel. You know, to get promoted, to get grants, to get books published, to do things like that. You have to work, you know, to make that happen. It's not at all an 8-to-5 job. And I guess I knew that, but I didn't know that. You know, I didn't know what it really meant. So my students now, in fact, will look at my life, and I share with them quite a bit about what happens in my life and what I do in the evenings in terms of my work and family and weekends. And so I think they're being better educated or more aware of what it's like, what's going to take, and then you decide whether you want to pursue that or not. So that would have been one thing I think that would have been useful.
And letting students know that you will be taking work home. You know,
Yes,
it's now a
yes.
9-to-5 kind of job.
No. Fortunately, I don't enjoy television, and so for me, I read, or I'm doing my work. I do gardening and some physical things outside, and cycling, and so I do some of those things. But it's not the typical 9-to-5 job. Dolly Parton would be dissatisfied with 9-to-5 academic life. So I guess, you know, it's been a wonderful journey, but I probably leave by saying that I wish I could say it was all planned and all anticipated, but that's totally not true. It really has been a journey that's been fantastic, but it's been one that went here and then came over here a little bit, and then back here, and then over here, and then here, and it's always been, I think, maybe a figure that goes like this, a spiral, you know, would capture more, because you're always going up, so to speak, towards some direction. But there are times when you're coming back down again, like, oh gosh, do I really want to spend this time doing this? And so there's a lot of hard work there. And it's not a direct path either. It's one that's, that some fortunate things happen. And I was extremely fortunate with my family background. I mean, I defied a lot of odds, but I defied those odds because of the background I had that allowed me to do that, that created those conditions for that to be the case.
Oh, fantastic. Once again, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It is very appreciated and something to learn from, and to show other individuals that it's definitely not a direct path, and individuals have very distinct paths to where they end up. So once again, Dr. Ollendick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.